Hey there guys, welcome back to another installment where we test all the performance effects of various hardware components. Today we're going to be taking a look at CPUs, whereas we've previously looked at RAM and hard drives versus solid state drives respectively. If you're interested in either one of those two videos, I'll have them linked down below. So if you remember previously, we said that the hard drive or solid state drive is akin to your long-term memory, RAM is equivalent to your short-term memory. So continuing on with that metaphor, what is the CPU equivalent to? It's kind of philosophical, but it's sort of how fast can you think. The faster CPU is, the faster it can get through the tasks put in front of it. So one of the metaphors I used in the previous video was if you had a whole laundry list full of tasks, one of the ways you could speed up is by remembering more of the tasks at once, you don't have to keep checking, or by remembering those things faster. But of course, a third way you could get through that list faster is also if you can physically think of how to do those tasks quicker. So a really easy analogy for this one is actually if you've ever played the Game Boy game Brain Age, they had a very simple little mini game in it where basically you got either 20 or 100 very simple mathematical equations, and the objective was to simply rip through the whole list as fast as you can. Now, one of the ways you could do that, of course, is by trying to remember more of those equations while you're doing your writing so you don't have to keep stopping and looking up. Another way you could do it faster is by remembering those equations quicker when they came in order. But the third way, and the way that most people try to get through it fastest, was by just thinking quicker. Doing the equations quicker gets you a faster score. Now, before we get too far into things, just like last time, if you're already familiar with how all the hardware and stuff works and you don't want an explanation, hey, absolutely no problems. Down in the description, I will have timestamps for any particular section of the video. You can just automatically skip ahead. Now, for everyone else, just like a human brain, a computer can actually only focus on a single task at once. Using our Brain Age example, you couldn't think of the answer to 3 or 4 questions simultaneously. You can only think of the answers to the questions one after the other. Now, computers kind of get around this, and they have for, well, Christ, more than a full decade now, by essentially wedging more than one brain into their skull. Now, there's not really a direct one-to-one answer for this one, so what we're going to do for our metaphor from this point in the video forward is we're going to start looking at the CPU as a group of humans, because in this case, it's actually going to make more sense if we do so. Now, to understand how the CPU could affect Total Warhammer, let's go back to that metaphor that I said of now multiple humans. Let's picture a group of construction workers standing around a hole. Now, let's establish some ground rules before we go any further. Let's say all these construction workers are really firmly unionized, so you can't pay any one of them more than what you can pay the rest. And just like most humans, the more you pay them, you'll get a little bit more work out of them. It might not be perfect, but you'll get a bit more as time goes on. But of course, you only have so much money. You couldn't just pay these guys an infinite amount and expect an infinite amount of work back. In this particular metaphor, money can essentially be substituted in for voltage and or heat because they're very closely related concepts, and how fast they can work is actually basically CPU frequency. It is literally how fast the CPU can work. Now, continuing on with our metaphor, the guy in the hole is doing the task we actually care about, working on Total Warhammer. The rest of these guys all standing above the hole, they might be doing literally nothing, or they might be working on really tiny irrelevant system tasks, enough just to sort of keep the computer up and running in the background. Now, using this metaphor, you can actually already see the problem. If we want this guy in the hole, the guy who's working on Total Warhammer, to work faster, sure, we can increase his salary, but we're also going to have to increase the salary to all these guys above standing around. In our game, this is actually problematic. We only have so much heat available, so the more heat we waste on irrelevant components, the less we can actually get useful work out of for Total Warhammer. So very rapidly when it comes to CPU overclocking, you will hit a wall where no more performance can be gained by just dumping more and more amperage or voltage into the system. Now, when it comes to CPU overclocking, there is so many variables, like infinitely more variables than I could possibly attempt to cover in a single video. And in fact, I already had to split this video into 2 chunks, otherwise it was going to go on for goddamn ever. So in this particular video, we are going to focus exclusively on frequency. We are not going to affect anything else, we are not going to try affect anything else, but even that on its own still had a lot of variables left over. So one of the things I did to try and contain the variables as much as possible, I did not affect my fan curves between any different runs. I also set the voltage to a static voltage, and I did not tweak that across any of the other runs. Now, if you're already coming to scream at me in the comments, yes, I know that is the worst possible way to affect clocks. However, I wanted to try and minimize the amount of variables going on here, and that was the most strict and stable method I could think of for doing so. As a friendly recap, my system is currently running 2933 megahertz of 64 gigabytes of Corsair Vengeance RAM. I also have it sitting on an MSI X470 motherboard, currently being run through Windows 7 64-bit Ultimate Edition. And I also have a 280mm liquid cooling loop on top. And for this particular video, I'm going to bring it up because it's important. The thermal interface is not a thermal compound. I actually have liquid metal on there. So thermals are pretty easily kept in check on this particular system. However, since last time, it is no longer below freezing, and in fact, it's actually shot up all the way past 10 degrees Celsius where I live. So I will still keep an eye on thermals. Spoiler alert, throttling never occurred in any of these tests, but it is just something to keep in mind. Everything else is kept exactly the same as what we have been doing, game settings, mod list, everything else like that. It's 100% identical. We're going to go through 4 different methods this time, just to try and minimize the amount of variables. However, overall, I actually went through 8 different variations. I will have the other 4 in a second video. Now, just to quickly recap the baseline established last week, we had an 82-second average time to load in or to create a brand new campaign, with the range being between 81 and 82 seconds, so really tight timings. There was an 80-second emission for too fast, 82-second emission for too slow. For the end turn times, we had a 41-second average, with the range being between 41 and 43, so again, pretty damn tight. There was a 40-second emission for too fast, 43-second emission for too slow. And then lastly, for the laboratory benchmark, we had a 39 frame per second average, with the timings remaining between 38.9 and 39.1, with a 39.2 emission for too fast and a 38.7 emission for too slow. But now, what do things look like if we try to aim for minimum spec? Well, it's kind of hard for me to actually know what minimum spec is, because annoyingly, Total Warhammer only lists a minimum spec for Intel CPUs, and of course I'm on an AMD. Now, the word on the street is that apparently Ryzen has a slightly better IPC than what the Intel does, so clock for clock, the AMD should actually punch a little higher. So to kind of fudge the results, I set my multiplier down to 28, so I have a 2.8 gigahertz processor. This is 0.2 gigahertz slower than what the Intel bare minimum is, but bearing in mind, this is on an 8-core Ryzen, and again, it's supposed to have a little bit better IPCs in the first place. So that was the closest I could get to sort of minimum spec for this particular video. We will discuss something next video. So how does minimum spec actually hold up? Really badly. My heart goes out to those of you who actually are using a minimum spec CPU. This sucks. Anyways, new campaign took 93 seconds on average, with there being 0 variation. It was always 93 seconds. There was a 92 and 94 second emission for too slow and too fast. Their end turn times were 47 seconds, with pretty tight timings of 46 to 47, with a 46-second run emitted and a 48-second run emitted. But man, the benchmark is where the slowness really showed its head. This dropped all the way down to 34.5 frames per second average, with the divide being 34.4 to 34.6, and another 34.4 run emitted for too fast, and a 34.7 run emitted for too slow. And again, like, this was just awful. I said in the last video that historically, when the frames per second came down, it wasn't actually that they all came down, it was more that just the minimums came down. This one came down literally everywhere, including the minimums, but the highs did the same. So, like, there was just no point where this run was nice. Now, the previous 2 tests, we have forced Ryzen to remain at a static clock. We have not allowed it to pick its own speed as required. Why would you ever want to do this? Well, let's go back to our dude in the hole and the dudes above him metaphor. If we really wanted the guy in the hole to work faster, but we didn't want to waste our money on everyone, one thing we could do is to tell the guy in the hole, hey, you know what? Work as fast as you need to or as slow as you need to, and when you work faster, we'll pay you more for that specific work. This is kind of like how a boost clock works. It's not going to boost up everything all the time as required, but as individual cores are boosted up faster, it will provide a little bit of extra grunt to that core so that it can hit faster speeds. At least that's the theory. It really fell apart on me here. I was hoping to lead these results to the 4th thing because I had really high hopes for it, but it just 100% didn't work out in my favor. So I guess let's start with the new Mortal Empires campaign. This took 83 seconds on average, which the keen-eyed among you might notice is actually inexplicably worse than just the base clock with no boosting allowed. Ranges were between 83 and 84 seconds, with an 83 and 84 second run, each of them emitted for just being the fastest and slowest. End turn times went to 41 seconds on average, with a range of 40 to 42, and a 40 and 43 second run emitted for too fast and too slow. Moving over to the benchmark, we picked up a colossal 0.1 frames per second, with the range being between 39 and 39.3 frames per second, with another 39 run emitted for too fast and another 39.3 second run emitted for too slow. Again, I was really disappointed by these results, but I did end up figuring out what had happened. So when you allow Ryzen to boost itself, it's actually looking at two separate variables. How much voltage does it have available to boost itself, and what are the thermals like? Now, of course, the thermals were gorgeous. In fact, the fans barely even spun up across all of these tests. But because I wasn't allowing it to take any more voltage, I think Ryzen just didn't even really attempt to boost itself. I did do a few runs with hardware monitor running in the background, and like the best boost I ever got was 400 megahertz for some reason. Yet the thermals were staying like chilled, like all the way down to 30 to 40 degrees, so it wasn't really boosting properly. This would probably go away if I did allow it to adjust its own voltage, which is what 99% of the population would do, so in reality, these results would actually probably be pretty good, but I can't make an exception for one particular run and then not do it for other runs. It'll kind of screw up the results. But that's enough sadness and disappointment. Let's move over to something fun. Let's move over to the overclocked results. And also, let's start things out on a comedic note. I couldn't figure out why my normal overclock wasn't working. I normally keep my system at 42.5 times multiplier, so 4.25 gigahertz. But for some reason, it just wouldn't accept that. It wouldn't post like that this time. And then I remembered, oh, right, I choked the crap out of the voltage. It can't possibly hit that. I did actually manage to get all the way up to a 41 times multiplier, though, so I was actually very impressed with what the chip would do, even without giving it any particular voltage to allow it to properly overclock. As for the results themselves, they were impossibly good. And like, I don't just mean like, oh yeah, it was pretty good. I mean like, logistically, they don't make sense from how good they were. The new campaign time dropped all the way down to 59 seconds with like zero variation there. 59, bang, 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 bang. But you'll notice that's almost a 30% decrease, but our overclock isn't 30% on its own. So like, I'm not sure how we got that much of an appreciable gain, but it was consistent, like time after time, 59 seconds, bang, bang, bang. Anyways, the end turn times, they were between 44 and 45 seconds with a 45-second average, with one of the 44s and one of the 45-second runs just being emitted for the top and low end specifically. This was actually more impressive than what the numbers probably make it look like. This was a pretty complicated run. This was one of the times where like everything that could happen did, and yet that's still one of the fastest results. Like, this was the first time I've actually seen something affect the end turn times in an appreciable way. But as much as those were cool, they got nothing on the benchmark. This went all the way up to 41.4 frames per second average, with the low end being 41.3 and the high end being 41.6. There also was a 41.3 and a 41.6 run, each emitted for being fastest and slowest. And like, this was rock solid stability. This never once dropped below 30 frames per second, no matter how chaotic things got. This was a really nice run. Alright, so what are some conclusions we can draw here? Well, it's kind of a weird result because in order to eliminate variables, I kind of hamstrung the CPU by restricting its voltage. But even in doing so, we can still draw some pretty interesting conclusions. Like, first things first, will an overclock gain you performance? Yeah, almost assuredly. If we compare our RAM results to our CPU results, the RAM cost $400 to get a 2.3 frame per second increase. The CPU cost literally nothing to me to get a 2.4 frame per second increase. Though, of course, there's a big asterisk on that. A lot of this is just due to factors we'll discuss later. I'm not saying anyone's going to get, a stark increase from just a CPU overclock, but there's definitely an appreciable gain on the table for quite a few of people on there. 2, should I overclock? Well, given what I literally just said, you would naturally assume that the answer is an obvious no duh, right? Well, hold your horses there. Remember how I said that the boost clock wasn't actually being allowed to boost in our particular case? Just for fun, I went back into the BIOS later and allowed the CPU to request as much voltage as it wanted, and from that point forward, it just consistently 100% pulled 3.9 gigahertz in every single benchmark, which took it all the way up to a respectable 40.4 frames per second, while still staying cooler and preventing my fans from turning into jet turbines compared to our overclocked result. See, one of the issues with overclocking is heat, and I think a lot of folks assume that the heat only ever comes from increasing the voltage, but the transistor switching also produces heat, so the more times they do that, the more heat you create. Even without even touching the voltage, The overclock result shot up to 71 degrees Celsius when overclocked, compared to the base run, which stayed between 30 and 40 degrees at the exact same voltage. And while experienced overclockers will no doubt say, like, 71 degrees is still not dangerous or anything, it's actually a fairly safe temperature, but you can see how things could get out of control with static overclocks. And there again, remember, the cooling solution I have on this setup is stupidly over the top. Like, if you had a weaker cooler, or God forbid, a stock cooler, there's no way in hell you're getting to a 4.1 gigahertz on all cores. You might not even get to 3.9 gigahertz on all cores, so at that point, why not just let the CPU do its own thing and give you better results than you even could in that case? Alright, should you buy a faster CPU for gaming? Again, it depends. If you're already doing a new build anyways, well then, sure, why not aim for a faster CPU so you can start off with a better foundation. But if your current CPU is doing just fine, would I spend the money for a better clocked one? No, definitely not for gaming. I would save your money if you really wanted to boost CPU performance. You can get a little bit of the nightmare fuel that is liquid metal like what I have, and that'll trim your temperatures down actually a fairly appreciable bit. And you also can worry about increasing cooling throughout the rest of your system and your case and your CPU cooler. Those changes will help benefit any future changes that you make to the system while still being considerably cheaper than a new CPU would. Why did I keep the voltages the same? Well, there's a few reasons for this. One, I wanted to minimize the amount of variables between runs, but two, next week we're going to be looking at the effects of different core counts and threads, and voltage has a really big effect there, so it would have completely screwed the results for everyone if I'd done that. On top of that too, my cooling solution is definitely abnormal for most folks, so I don't want to show results that seem like massively, gratuitously over the top if it doesn't apply to like 99% of people out there. And then last thing, why did we get the results that we got? Like, why did it get so much better for such a fairly mild overclock? Well, I actually think that there's two things going on here, but this is just me guessing at this one. One, I think getting the CPU running quicker allowed the faster RAM to actually help the CPU even more than what it normally would, so we probably wouldn't have seen quite an appreciable gain if I'd stuck with slower or smaller RAM. And then two, because the SSD transfer speed was probably massively oversaturating the lane width compared to what the CPU could actually draw from, the drive was actually probably waiting on the CPU a lot of the time so that it could send more of its own data. But by having the CPU running faster, not only could it crunch the data it received quicker, it was also probably grabbing more chunks of information quicker. But anyways, that's going to wrap it up for this of the first two halves of the CPU stuff. As I just alluded to, next week we're going to take a look at core counts and threading and how those affect the system. So you'll really want to stay tuned for that because this one was probably easily predicted for a lot of people. I've got a sneaking suspicion next week is going to surprise everyone. As always though, I want to thank you so much for watching and I'll see you all next time.